Now we know that ecosystems are the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic factors in an area. What we can start to do is think about how these processes affect energy and matter. Now, in this video, we're going to explain how energy and matter flow through an ecosystem, and this is through processes such as abiotic and biotic factors, and we'll have a look at these and give examples to explain how this happens. If we take energy to start, energy essentially is what gives us the ability to do things. So it allows us to grow, it allows us to reproduce, it allows us to move, etc. All these kind of things are really important in terms of ecology. We're going to take a very simple habitat here, and the habitat essentially is kind of like a temperate woodland. There are trees and there's some plants. We've got some primary consumers, which are your kind of rabbits and squirrels that will feed on the plant material. We've got a fox that's going to be our predator that feeds on those rabbits and squirrels. And then at the bottom, this makes up our soil. Okay, so this is what essentially we're looking at here. And of course, we've got the sun at the top. Now, the sun's really important because the sun gives light, and light is what drives the entire process. Every little bit of energy that goes into this system comes from the sun. Now, the plants have adapted over time to take sunlight and convert it into sugars such as glucose by process of photosynthesis. Now, that's a biotic factor. And what we've got here is an interaction between the sun, which is abiotic, it's non-living, and a plant, which is living. So those two there make an interaction. So almost immediately, we have an ecosystem of sorts. Now, the plants themselves will grow leaves, they'll grow fruits and nuts and things like that, berries, and these will be eaten by animals who cannot harness energy from the sun. This is shown here. So this arrow represents eating and digestion and assimilation of the products in those particular fruits and things like that they eat. Now, some animals like foxes are carnivores. They do not eat plant material unless it's absolutely necessary, and that's represented by this arrow here. Now, each of these arrows represents the flow of energy. So energy flows from the sun into the plants, and then into the squirrel and the rabbit, and then into the fox. Now, at any given point, any of these free living things that we've got pictured here can die, and when they die, they return to the soil, and they return to the soil through decomposition. Things like fungi, bacteria, earthworms, maybe some insects will cause this breakdown to happen over time, and the energy will then pass to these particular individuals at the bottom. Now, this doesn't represent the entire flow of energy, because what this really says is that all the energy ends up in the soil, and that's not the case. Each stage along this process, heat is lost through respiration. So what we mean by respiration is the breakdown of sugars and things like that to give the energy, and there's heat release. And this happens at each stage. So all of these things give off heat, like so. Now, if you look at this particular process, it's more complex than this. There are other ways in which energy is lost, but what we must understand is this is a simple way of looking at energy flow through an ecosystem, and energy flow is unidirectional through an ecosystem. So if you follow the arrow from the sun, at some point, if you follow the arrow, you will end up at heat, and then that's the end of it. It doesn't go round in a circle. It's a one-directional flow. Now, matter is slightly different. Matter is what makes up the world around us. It's the atoms, the molecules, the particles that make up everything in the world around us. Now, matter obviously is already here on Earth, and we as animals and plants have adapted to take matter and turn it into complex things that make up our bodies. We get that from food and nutrients, essentially. Now, again, let's just take our very simple habitat and think about how this works. Now, plants can have adapted the ability to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they can convert that carbon dioxide with some other substances from the soil into amino acids, into glucose, and these kind of things. And these form proteins and sugars and fats and all these sorts of complex molecules that make up our bodies. And they form the basis of essentially what is a food web. Okay, so this next diagram is going to represent a basic food web, and it shows the way in which matter moves through an ecosystem. So we start with the plant, and we know the plant is eaten by these primary consumers, these squirrels and these rabbits, and that arrow now shows that the atoms in the plant end up as atoms in the rabbit. Okay, and then the fox comes along and eats the rabbit, and it assimilates all of its atoms into its body, and therefore the atoms in a fairly short period of time can go from being in a plant to being in a fox. And this is just through processes, biological processes like predation and digestion and building up materials in our bodies. And again, what we have to understand is that all of these three things on this line are living things, and therefore, if they're living, they die. And when they die, they return to the soil, and they are decomposed. And when they decompose, these decomposers at the bottom, the fungi, the worms, the bacteria, the insects, will take on the atoms from the animals and the plants and put them into their own bodies. Now, some of these decomposers are really important in terms of returning these atoms back to where they started, because if this continued over time, we'd have a very unsustainable process, because all of the atoms would end up in the soil, in the decomposers, and we wouldn't have any plants and animals. Now, these decomposers can convert things like proteins and sugars, fats, into simple inorganic molecules. And in simple inorganic molecules are things like nitrates, things like that, that sit in the soil. These are basically nutrients. And nutrients are taken on by plants through their roots, and the plants can assimilate these simple organic molecules into proteins and sugars and fats. And they do this by taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and taking in the light that we talked about in the last slide, and through processes in the plant, they can create complex molecules that then start this cycle all over again. So we have to understand that matter is cycled, it's recycled. So if you follow an arrow, the arrow always leads back to the plant, and it goes round and round and round. And what we understand is that the plants and the decomposers are really driving this process. You could actually remove the animals from this particular image, and you'd still have a cycle in that place, because you need photosynthesis to bring the matter down from the atmosphere, and you need the decomposers in the soil to give you the simple organic molecules. Okay, so let's just quickly summarize. Energy flow is unidirectional through an ecosystem, and it relies on both biotic and abiotic interactions within that ecosystem, and that's what makes it work. Energy enters an ecosystem as sunlight, and plants harness energy to form matter, which they absorb from the soil. Okay, so the simple organic materials are taken up by the plant, mixed with that energy from the sun, to create the basis of every food chain. Animals consume plants and other animals to obtain energy and matter. So most animals, in fact all animals, cannot photosynthesize. They have to eat something else. And then decomposers recycle matter, returning it to the soil, ending the cycle. Okay, you can now have a go